The auction behind Miller's Tavern was never meant for daylight, and yet the late afternoon sun hung over it like an accusation. It spilled through broken slats and over the packed dirt, catching dust in the air and turning it into something almost beautiful, which only made the ugliness beneath feel worse. Jonah Hale stopped at the edge of the crowd, one boot half in shadow, half in light, as if even his body couldn't decide whether to step fully into what was happening there. He hadn't planned to be here. He told himself that again, as a man's laughter cut sharp through the air. Jonah had come into town for wire, flour, and a new hinge for the barn door. Ordinary things, safe things. But noise had a way of pulling at him, especially the kind edged with cruelty, and his feet had followed it before his mind could stop them. A rough platform of crates stood near the tavern's back wall. A lantern hung crookedly from a nail, its flame trembling even though there was no wind. On the crates swayed a man with a red face and eyes gone glassy with drink. One hand clutched a bottle. The other was wrapped tight around the arm of a young woman standing beside him. He yanked her forward hard enough that her boots scraped the dirt. "Don't hear a damn thing," he slurred, voice thick and proud in the ugliest way. "Born wrong. Ain't no use to her mouth, but she works. Strong as any mule." He shook her arm to prove it, as if she were an object instead of a person. Jonah's hands curled slowly into fists. He forced them open again. He'd seen hard things in his life, had lived through winters that killed men, and summers that burned cattle down to bone. But this was something else. This was a man selling what little soul he had left. The girl didn't fight the grip, but she didn't slump either. She stood straight, shoulders squared, head bowed, just enough to keep her eyes from meeting the crowd. Her hair was braided neatly down her back, not a strand out of place, like she'd done it that morning with care, with the stubborn belief that small order still mattered. Around her neck hung a rough board on a string, the word "deaf" chalked in block letters so thick they looked angry. Men laughed, one spat, another made a comment Jonah didn't want to hear twice. Coins were already being fingered, weighed in palms. Jonah watched the girl instead of the crowd. He told himself he was just curious, just looking, but his eyes stayed fixed on her face. When a shout went up close by, she didn't flinch. When a bottle clattered to the ground and shattered, she didn't startle. It all fit the lie the man was selling until it didn't. Someone behind her leaned toward a friend and whispered something low and mean. Jonah couldn't even make out the words himself, but the girl's eyes shifted. Just a fraction, just enough. A flick toward the sound, fast and instinctive, like a bird turning its head. Then she went still again. Jonah felt his breath catch. The bidding started. It wasn't grand or dramatic. No fancy auctioneer's chant. Just men calling out numbers like they were talking about sacks of grain. Low prices, insulting ones. Jonah felt something hard and heavy settle in his chest. A weight that didn't belong to the present moment alone. It dragged memories with it, of his own quiet house, of nights eaten in silence, of the way loneliness could make a man look away from wrong just to survive another day. "5," someone called. "6," another answered, laughing. The drunk father beamed as if any of this were a victory. He lifted the bottle to his mouth, missed, and sloshed whiskey down his chin. Jonah raised his hand. His voice came out steady, surprising even him. He named a price that was too high for what these men thought they were buying, high enough to make heads turn and mouths close. For a moment, even the lantern flame seemed to freeze. The drunk blinked. Then he grinned wide, showing teeth stained yellow. "Sold!" he barked, eager, before anyone could reconsider or outbid out of spite. The rope around the girl's wrist was cut. The board around her neck was yanked away and tossed aside like trash. Jonah stepped forward. He could feel eyes on his back, measuring, judging, misunderstanding. He didn't care. He took off his coat and held it out, slow, so she could see every movement. She hesitated, looking at the coat, then at his hands, then finally up at his face. Her eyes were dark and clear, not dull or empty the way the word on the board had promised. She took the coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her fingers brushed his wrist just for a second, warm, roughened by work, real. Outside the tavern yard, the sky chose that moment to break. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, flattening dust into dark patches of mud. Jonah led the horse closer and gestured, showing her how to step up. He didn't touch her unless necessary, and when he did, he made sure she could see it coming. They moved away from the tavern as the rain washed the sound of laughter into something distant and dull. Jonah walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, aware of every step she took. He pointed to himself, then down the road, then made a wide gesture toward the horizon. "Ranch," he said, slow and clear, even though he believed she couldn't hear. He mimed sleeping, then eating, then working, trying to make his intentions plain without trapping her in promises he couldn't keep. She nodded once, small and precise. As they passed the edge of town, Jonah heard the drunk man's laugh again, floating out behind them, thin and sharp as broken glass. His jaw tightened. He kept walking, eyes forward. Then under the steady rhythm of rain on leather and earth, he heard it. "Don't look back." The words were barely louder than the rain, almost swallowed by it, but they were there, clear, certain. Jonah stopped so abruptly the horse tossed its head. His heart hammered as he turned. The girl didn't look at him. She stared ahead, jaw set, hands folded in the sleeves of his coat. Rain slid down her braid, darkening it, making it shine. She hadn't spoken loudly. She hadn't spoken for attention. She had spoken because she meant it. Jonah stood there in the rain, understanding crashing over him all at once. The lie, the danger, the truth he'd nearly missed. He said nothing. He only nodded once, the way a man does when he knows he's crossed a line he can never uncross. They walked on together, leaving the tavern and its shadows behind, the sound of rain covering their footsteps as the road opened up into something unknown. The rain had eased by the time they reached the ranch, thinning to a mist that clung to the world instead of striking it. Jonah guided the horse through the gate and closed it behind them, the familiar creak of wood settling his nerves, even as his thoughts raced. The land stretched wide and quiet, rolling grass darkened by water, fence posts standing like patient sentries. He watched the girl, Lila, though he did not yet know her name, take it all in. Her gaze moved slowly, respectfully, as if she were afraid the place might vanish if she looked too quickly. He helped her down from the horse, and careful to keep his hands visible, his movements deliberate. She landed lightly, boots sinking a little into the wet earth. For a moment they simply stood there, the air cool and clean after the rain, the smell of damp soil and sage rising around them. Jonah cleared his throat, then stopped himself. Old habits. He gestured toward the house and waited until she nodded before leading the way. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over the rough table and the stone hearth. Jonah suddenly became aware of everything that spoke of a lone man's life, the single plate, the patched chair, the silence that lived in the corners. He set to work without looking at her, ladling stew into a bowl, slicing bread, pouring milk. He placed the food on the table, then stepped back and gestured for her to sit. He took another step back after that, giving her space enough to breathe. She sat, shoulders easing just a little as she ate. She didn't rush, didn't hoard, but neither did she hesitate. She ate like someone who understood hunger well enough not to waste time pretending it wasn't there. Jonah watched from the stove, pretending to busy himself while keeping her in the corner of his eye. Every now and then she glanced up at him, her gaze sharp, searching. It wasn't fear he saw there. It was assessment. When she finished, Jonah pointed toward the small room off the kitchen. He'd put clean sheets on the bed that morning without knowing why, just a restless feeling that had pushed him to do it. He opened the door so she could see inside, then stepped away. He drew a line in the dirt floor with the heel of his boot, right down the middle of the cabin, then another line toward the door that led outside to the barn. He tapped his chest, then shook his head, then pointed to the far side of the line. It was a clumsy way to say what mattered most. "You are safe here, and you are not mine." She watched him, then surprised him by speaking. "I hear." The words were soft but clear, like a stone dropped into still water. Jonah froze, one hand still resting on the doorframe. He turned slowly to face her. She met his eyes without flinching. "Enough," she added, as if explaining something ordinary. "Not always, not far. Loud sounds blur. Men shouting, it turns to noise." She paused, searching his face. "But you speak slow." Jonah sat heavily in the chair opposite her. Relief and something like shame tangled inside his chest. "I thought—" He stopped, then shook his head. Words felt dangerous right now. He tapped his ear, raised his brows in question. She nodded. "Since I was small, fever took some, not all." Her mouth tightened briefly. "My father said deaf was easier. Easier to sell, easier to explain when I didn't answer fast enough. My name's Jonah," he said quietly this time. "Lila," she replied. The way she said it made it sound precious, like something she didn't offer often. Jonah stood and went to the shelf where he kept paper and a stub of pencil. His hands shook just a little as he wrote, slow and careful. "You are free." He pushed the paper across the table toward her, then placed a small pile of coins beside it. "The kind a hired hand might earn in a week." He stepped back again, as if afraid even standing too close might turn the words into a lie. Lila stared at the paper. Her fingers hovered over it, then pressed it flat, as if to make sure it was real. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her sleeve, close to her skin. "I know," she said, "but freedom needs a place to stand." Jonah nodded. He understood that better than he wanted to admit. He pointed toward the fields, the barn, the tools stacked neatly by the wall. "Work," he said. "If you want. Wages, choice." He made a small motion toward the door, then to her, then back to himself, trying to show that leaving would never be blocked. The next days unfolded with a quiet rhythm Jonah hadn't known he'd been missing. Lila woke early and went to work without being asked, fixing fence lines with a skill that surprised him. She learned the land quickly, noticing things Jonah had stopped seeing, where water pooled after rain, which boards needed replacing before they failed. She listened with her eyes and hands as much as with her ears, and Jonah learned to slow himself, to face her when he spoke, to let silence do some of the work words usually rushed to fill. At night, Jonah lay in his bed listening to the house breathe differently. Sometimes he heard Lila humming softly in her room, a low thread of sound that seemed to stitch the dark together. It wasn't loud enough to carry far, but it was steady, and Jonah realized she must hear herself just enough to trust the tune. Other times, he heard his own boots on the porch before he even reached it, and wondered if she heard them too. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the hills in gold, Lila stood beside him at the fence line. She raised her hands and made a few awkward gestures, hesitant but hopeful. Jonah frowned, then laughed quietly as he tried to copy her, his fingers clumsy and slow. She laughed too, surprised by the sound of it, and the laughter lingered between them like something newly born. "What made you see me?" she asked, her voice careful, as if the question mattered more than the answer. Jonah looked out over the pasture, then back at her. "You heard the lie," he said, "and I saw the truth." Lila nodded, the wind lifting loose strands of her hair as the day faded. In the wide quiet of the ranch, sound and silence lived side by side, no longer enemies. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to pretend to be less than she was, and Jonah, standing there with her, realized he was no longer alone. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel.